The Financial Times this week tells the story of a former US military operations officer, Mark Hertling. It was during Operation Desert Storm, the US invasion to remove Iraq from Kuwait. Hertling was in a squadron of armoured vehicles, and he talked about the day that he heard a series of loud pops overhead. Now that turned out to be 5 cluster bombs. Bombs that carry a load of small charges which are scattered before impact to rain down across a much larger area to provide a higher kill rate of whatever forces or whoever else happens to be unlucky enough to be in range. These are pretty horrible, indiscriminate weapons, and with a high rate of short-term duds which can take out unlucky people for years to come. Many countries, 123 in total, have banned their possession or use. Hertling was wounded alongside 30 other soldiers, not all of whom were so lucky. Now the real kicker to this story, these were, he's pretty sure, American cluster bombs. America, of course, has not banned their use. It was so-called friendly fire in that incident. The FT was recounting this story, of course, because this week America decided to provide exactly such cluster bombs to Ukraine. The new weapons package, unveiled last Friday, includes 155mm DPICMs, which stands for Dual Purpose Improved Conventional Munitions. As you can expect, this has sparked a fierce and troubled debate. Ukraine is short on ammunition, a factor in the slow progress it's been making in its counter-offensive in recent weeks. Ukraine reports that its troops are limited to firing 100,000 rounds a month, which they suggest is just a quarter of what the Russians are using. The ability to use cluster munitions would make a difference. So on the one side of the equation you have that. War is hell. Nobody uses nice weapons to kill people with love. And people also point out Ukraine is using them on its own territory to defend itself against Russian soldiers, military on the front line. It isn't, unlike Russia, dropping them on someone else's territory with a mix of military and civilian casualties. Russia has been using them from day one of the invasion, and the argument goes if Ukraine is given sufficient firepower to actually win the war, it will result in fewer lives being lost long term. The longer it drags on, the more people, including civilians, will die as a result. But then you could use variations of that argument to justify almost anything short of nuclear weapons. And it has been used historically to justify actions that, after the event, many people condemned as being beyond the pale. It's just that because decades after the event, people have the luxury to be judgmental about the hard choices made by those with their backs firmly against the wall, does that make that judgment right? Or do we run the risk of giving up the values we lay claim to rather easily, just because there's a reason to? Critics of Joe Biden from his own party have tended to take that tack, to argue that it risks losing the moral high ground. The New York Times called it flawed moral logic. President Biden admitted that this was a, quote, difficult decision, but he claimed that the newer munitions being sent have a lower dud rate, so fewer incidences of unintended harm to civilians. If you believe him. The International Committee of the Red Cross apparently doesn't, saying that recent conflicts have suggested that the dud rates ranged from 10 to 40%. And it's not helped by the fact that some of the most notorious uses of such weapons in history was indeed by the US itself, particularly in Laos and Vietnam. The least interesting part of the reaction is that from Moscow, which rehearsed a familiar line when it said that if they were used, it would respond with countermeasures. Yeah, well, since Russia has been using cluster munitions itself routinely already, And it's not as though it's only half trying to win the war, therefore has some great powerful riposte that it's been keeping in reserve, but it would be motivated to use that by the use of cluster weapons. Yeah, it doesn't seem likely. In any case, we're not talking theoretically here, since Ukraine says it has already now received some of those cluster munitions from the US, marking something of a rapid turnaround, unusually. Gives you some sense of the urgency that must have been driving events behind the scenes. It's a reminder that countries that see themselves as great powers, who reserve the right to fight to win in armed conflict should the situation arise, are deeply reluctant to bind their hands in the absence of something demonstrably self-destructive, like nuclear weapons. America, Russia, China, indeed Ukraine, all countries that did not sign the convention to ban cluster bombs. Is it morally wrong for the US to supply these weapons? Well, the moral choice was made to have the weapons in the first place. So at that point, the judgments really are how they get used and against whom. If Ukraine is prepared to use them on its own territory, many would say that is their call, under the circumstances. But let's not get away from the whole war is hell theme and make such moral choices too easily made. Yes, sometimes hard decisions have to be made in conflicts. They're supposed to be hard. We should worry when they become normalised and easy. Ukraine, however, is highly aware that it is on the clock. The counter-offensive has been slow going, and it got a reminder this week that it can take not much for granted in terms of the continuing support of the Alliance of Free Nations. This week we saw at the NATO summit at Vilnius, Ukraine wanted, and I mean it really wanted, the summit to end with a clear and unambiguous declaration that it would become a full NATO member once the war ends. That pressure was particularly resisted, according to reports, by the United States and by Germany, which created instead a form of words that vaguely stated that we will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine when allies agree and conditions are met. When allies agree and conditions are met. Could be code for saying when hell freezes over, for all we know. Zelensky, whose people are fighting and dying in a war, allowed frustration to spill out into public with an almost Trumpian-style tweet where he described the text as unprecedented and absurd. A Ukrainian official familiar with the negotiations said that Ukrainians were, quote, disappointed with how NATO works and felt that there was no real dialogue with the alliance on the issue. Needless to say, that sort of public pushback went down badly with some, particularly some who have been committing billions of dollars worth of military assistance. The UK Defence Secretary, for one, Ben Wallace, said that Zelensky should be more grateful for the support that he had received and to remember that allies were not like Amazon, there to supply whatever was needed on demand. Now then there was a bit of a kerfuffle and diplomacy kicked in. It did its thing behind the scenes. Everyone reined it all back in very quickly. G7 leaders issued a declaration on a long-term security commitment to Ukraine. NATO leaders created a new NATO-Ukraine Council, along with dropping the need for a membership action plan ahead of joining. The Kremlin decided that all of this was serious enough to make it annoyed, and it said of the G7 action, "We believe that it's a mistake and can be very dangerous." The French, having long been perceived as a bit too conciliatory to Russia, took this opportunity to position themselves as squarely standing behind Ukraine. President Macron told reporters it is legitimate for the Ukrainian president to be demanding with us. So what was behind the tension of all of this? Really, it was Ukrainian fears that, firstly, the US role in the alliance is likely on a time fuse. Republicans in the US are getting tired of spending money on Ukraine. Some Democrats are not that far behind now. In particular, should the US be depleting some of its own stocks when it's in an increasingly difficult standoff with China and might need those stocks? And secondly, and perhaps most importantly, Ukraine is concerned that its desired membership of NATO could be being held as a potential bargaining chip for future negotiations with Russia. After all, if the US or NATO leaders decided to negotiate directly with Putin, they couldn't get Ukraine to agree to a specific course of action, like accepting the loss of territory, but they could bargain away their willingness to accept Ukraine into NATO. And you must feel that Ukraine sees that as a real threat. Hence Zelensky's determination, you might even say bordering on desperation, to get the path to membership nailed down in concrete terms. At the end, the Ukrainians said that what was offered went a long way to reassuring them. Whether that's what they say in private is another question. If I were them, and obviously there's a lot of private conversations that none of us are privy to, but if I was them, knowing what we know, I would trust nobody to do anything unless it's in their clear geopolitical interest to do so. Zelensky foreshadowed this when he was asked about it, and he said that he was clear the bargaining chip outcome would not be acceptable to Ukraine. I'm sure that there won't be betrayal from Biden or Scholz, he said, but still I need to say that we will never exchange any status for any of our territories, even if it's only one village with a population of one old man. Just waving around that B word, betrayal. It's a pretty strong word, clearly being kept in reserve should things go off the rail. Just to be clear. The spat rather undermines President Biden's words at the summit, where he said that Putin had pretty much already lost the war, saying that the counteroffensive would lead to negotiations to end it. Maybe that's a considered statement, drawing on knowledge that's not currently in the public domain, but certainly some of what Biden said at that press conference was patent nonsense, so I wouldn't make any presumptions. What was the nonsense? Well, that was that he gave an assurance that the US would stay committed to NATO in the long term. I absolutely guarantee it, he said. This is the man who's standing in an election against Donald Trump probably next year. And he then quickly backtracked. No one can guarantee the future, he contradicted himself, saying, but this is the best bet anyone could make. And that's as true today as it is now, and if it had gone in the net, it would have been a goal. It's all an object lesson in watching what people do, seen through the lens of how they perceive their self-interest, rather than spend a huge amount of time worrying about what they just said. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.